Hello, everybody. Hello, Dr. Haley. How are you today?
I'm fighting allergies as evidenced by my rubbing my eye here at the start. Welcome to podcast episode Death and Decomp podcast episode 12.
That's right. Fatal
And
Flaws, episode 2. Forensic flaws? Forensic
yeah, the
flaws,
second of the forensic flaws episodes.
which some do end up being fatal. So,
And today's topic is what, Amanda?
we are talking about fingerprints and friction ridge patterns.
Friction ridge patterns.
Right. Are we ready?
Yeah, insofar as I can be ready, I am.
Okay. Let's see. Last week we laid the foundation for issues in forensic science, right? And one of the things that we talked about were the pattern group, so things like fingerprints, bloodstain patterns. And today I think we're going to focus on fingerprints. So we decided?
Sure.
Yeah, okay. Well, let's talk about fingerprints then.
Well, this should be a short conversation because everybody has their own unique fingerprints, and you look at them, and if you're an expert, you can identify who that person is.
Oh, you're so funny. That's not the conversation we're going to have today at all.
Oh,
No, no. So let's start with one. Where and when are fingerprints formed?
let's see. Is this how this is going to go? You're going to ask me questions, and I'm going to
No,
have to answer. Okay, hands, fingers, palms, feet, toes, soles of the feet.
Yep. So all of them together are called friction ridges. And then we are most familiar with the friction ridges on the tips of our fingers that we call fingerprints. Characterized by these hills or ridges and furrows or valleys, right? And then they are formed embryonically.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yep, formed in utero and are generally thought not to change significantly throughout life. There might be scars added, and I think ridges can elongate or widen, but generally the print itself stays pretty
So
consistent.
if they're formed embryonically, does that mean that identical twins, that is to say twins with the same DNA, have the same fingerprints?
They do not. They have different fingerprints.
So may I use the expression, what the hell?
You may. They're formed by outside intervention. So they're not formed genetically.
What the hell? Part two, the sequel. What?
Let's see. I can't. That's the extent of my knowledge.
Oh, darn it!
That's okay. That's okay. We can do some Googling.
Aren't we supposed to be better prepared than that? I see that all that time we put together getting ready for this podcast was really well spent. If it goes off the rails here in the first 2 minutes.
Friction in the womb influences a fetus's fingerprint pattern.
So when those tiny little babies are waving their hands around, that friction changes the pattern.
Correct.
And the pattern's associated with cell growth, I assume.
Yes, and keratinization, which is why identical twins do not have the same fingerprints.
Okay.
Yep.
So that seems like a reasonably strong argument that they are unique.
Yeah. I think that's what a lot of people use as the primary example. If identical twins don't have the same fingerprints, then it's unlikely that other people around the world have the same fingerprints. The issue, as we will find out later in today's conversation, is not so much that the fingerprints may or may not be the same, but how they determine whether a fingerprint matches.
So there's features on the fingerprints that could be the same with different individuals, even if you looked at them holistically and said, no, this is unique. So the question would be, how many of those identifying features do you need to finally decide? And you had this all memorized. What are the features, Amanda?
Well,
All I know are whirls,
not
whirls
because
and
I'm a
dots,
fingerprint
right?
expert, just because I pretend to be one sometimes. So the fingerprint identifications or categorizations are divided into three levels. Level one is shape. So there's three shapes. You can have arches, you can have loops, or you can have whorls. So those are like what you can see when you look at your fingerprints. Arches go up and then down. Loops go up and then they come around and they exit out the same side that they started. And then whorls look like circular hurricanes. And then there's some variation within, so you can have like right loops, left loops, um, double loops. Like it gets a little more complicated. But then when you go down to level two identification, that's at the minutiae level. So it's things like where ridges bifurcate or split. You can have dots or islands. Um, Basically looking at, so you start with the shape of the fingerprint at level one, and then you look closer at smaller characteristics in level two. And then level three, which is the smallest, you're looking at individual pores within a ridge and ridge size and shape. So like width and length and that sort of thing.
And you said pores.
Correct. Pores.
Do they just look like holes?
Yes, they do. And when we talk about fingerprints being left behind, so like when you leave fingerprints from touching, mostly made of sweat with some amino acids and some oil. So that's what's left behind when we're talking about collecting fingerprints or people leaving behind fingerprints. It's mostly sweat, which is coming out of those pores from level three.
Isn't it? I thought it was oils that were left. You're saying it's not oils.
Some,
Doesn't the sweat evaporate?
I mean, maybe. I told you I'm
Okay.
not a fingerprint expert. I just said that's what fingerprints are composed of.
Okay.
Sweat,
Okay.
amino acids, and oils.
So to cut to the quick, I'll ask you the question before you ask me another question I'm going to get wrong. But what's the standard for identifying a fingerprint as belonging to a unique individual?
There isn't one.
So that's not an acceptable
Dun
answer.
dun dun.
That's sorry. That dog don't hunt. How can seriously, how can there not be a standard?
So currently accepted to exclude or include a print is 8 to 12 similarities. So there's 8 to 12 points on the fingerprint, excuse me, that line up.
Okay, that's
Um,
50% different. The 50% difference from 8 to 12, not trivial.
yep. And then some individual jurisdictions and or fingerprint examiners will go all the way up to 20. They won't reach a conclusion unless they can find 20.
So you told me this when we were preparing for today's podcast, which listeners are going to be surprised we actually do any prep. But so there's the first
Can't
shocking
tell.
item. How is it there's not a unified standard? I don't understand this, because it seems like it should be the most straightforward thing in the world, that you get a whole bunch of fingerprints, you statistically analyze, you start with do two, okay, what's my error rate? Do three, what's my error rate? Do four, what's the error rate? And just go through that until you get that rate of making an identification at whatever level you want. 95%, 99%, 99.9%.
Yeah, so from my research, it looks like they got together, they got a group together to do that in the 70s, in 1970, and it took them 3 years, and they came back with the conclusion that there should not be a a set number. Would you like me to read the quote?
Yeah, go ahead and read the
Okay.
painful quote.
Okay, this is from the fingerprint source book. It was published by the National Institute of Justice in 2011. This is from chapter 14. So, the primary task of the committee was to, quote, determine the minimum number of minutiae of friction-ridge characteristics which must be present in two impressions in order to establish positive identification, unquote. For 3 years, the committee addressed this issue, and in 1973, the Standardization Committee reached a consensus, quote, no valid basis exists at this time for requiring that a predetermined minimum number of friction-ridge characteristics must be present in two impressions in order to establish positive identification. The foregoing reference to friction-ridge characteristics applies equally to fingerprints, palm prints, toe prints, and sole prints of the human body, unquote. This conclusion was arrived at through interviews with professionals in the field, a review of the literature, surveys sent to various international identification bureaus, and the generally accepted view of the profession.
That's completely unacceptable.
So they tried it, 50 years ago. I do not know if that has been revisited in the subsequent years. But as of right now, there is no standard for the number of characteristics.
If you can't objectively, I would argue that if you cannot objectively state a number, how can you possibly claim this is scientific?
I'm not going to argue with you.
And based on that quote, do we even know if they did the sort of test, or they just survey a whole bunch of experts and they didn't come at the same conclusion, so they decide you can't get one?
Probably that.
And I'll give you one more. They probably didn't get one because, oh, here we go.
Hi, Phyllis.
Say hello, Phyllis, or not. I guess we're going to go with not on that. Did you like her T-shirt though?
Did.
Yeah, that graphic tee I thought is really cool.
Yeah. Always had killer style.
Yeah, I'm sure that people who won't use lower numbers don't want it to be somebody to say higher numbers or vice versa. I mean, there's all kinds of problems fraught with that. And it just doesn't seem conceptually very hard. It doesn't seem like this is a hard problem to resolve.
Yeah, you wouldn't think so. Now, full disclosure, neither one of us are fingerprint examiners, but
yeah, we don't know what we're talking about.
I think a lot of times when people think of fingerprints and collecting fingerprints, and I know that this is true for my students when I have them practice lifting prints, on TV, they dust it with their fingerprint powder, or they spray it with something like ninhydrin or some other chemical that helps bring that print so that you can see it better. And then they, put tape over it and they pull it up, and then they have this perfect print. But in reality, you have to find the fingerprints. You have to determine what type of surface they're on, because that decides how you prepare and lift it, potentially. And then you have to try to get a usable print from a surface. And if you don't pay attention to what you're touching, your fingerprints, or even if you do pay attention, your fingerprints are always going to be distorted or different than when you do the 10 print cards where, they take your fingerprints and they put them on a card. So, you're comparing sort of two potentially different things. I mean, they are both fingerprints, but one of them was taken neatly and the other one was lifted off of some sort of presumably 3D object. So, you have all this distortion and you have partial prints and they're really messy, and it depends on how much powder did you use, or how little powder did you use, or how well was that fingerprint photographed when it was uploaded into systems. And maybe that's why, maybe because if you're comparing partial prints, you would have a fewer number, but then I feel like you could argue that you shouldn't be making potential identifications on partial prints.
Well, that was going to be my question to you. Is there an impetus to say that you use fewer numbers because when you find prints that you don't have the complete you don't have the opportunity to have 20 points of identification. Maybe you only have 8.
Yeah, possibly.
But you could say the prints are consistent with individual X versus saying the prints show that individual X was there. Is that what the distinction? I mean, to me, that would be the distinction, that if you don't have enough points, you could still say they could exclude somebody, but they wouldn't necessarily show that they're there, which is not a bad, to me, is not a bad thing.
I think the problem comes in when that consistent with becomes a match
Well,
or the same. And so there's that, and I think we've talked about this a few times, the nuance or the subtlety and that sort of thing, and how, science generally is or can be nuanced. And so if you are saying it is consistent with, and it's the only piece of evidence, the only piece of physical evidence, is that enough to?
yeah, but if you're saying, if what's happening now is if there's 8 that people are using, they're saying that, whereas what if the truth is it's more like any larger number, 15
Mhm.
or 18, then that's wrong, right? You're saying that's an absolute match.
Right.
And you would think that if you did the statistical study where you looked at the number of points and you had a percent chance with it, then when you have partial prints, you would be able to make some statement about that. Well, that 83% of the time, this number of prints is consistent with so and so.
Or this number of characteristics.
It's not, sorry, number of
Yeah.
characteristics in a print, right?
Yeah. I know that there has been some work done on that sort of thing, but it's mostly most of the research that I've seen has been comparison. So they like send, I don't know, they might call them black box studies. They send known samples to fingerprint identification experts and ask them to make a conclusion based on what they're sent, and then they use that as a way to determine error rates and confidence
I
intervals.
would argue, Amanda, I saw those when I was looking through that book chapter and I was doing literature search. And I would argue they test the experts, but they don't test the real underlying rate. To do that, you need to have blind testing where you have paired from known individuals, paired sets from
Mm-hmm.
individuals. So you know they came from the same source. And then you do however many different numbers, and I would say I'm putting on my experimental design hat. Each person doing the rating is a replication.
Oh,
And so you do some number of those, and that's how you get the error rate in terms of.
I last time I looked, there was not any research like that.
I don't understand it. I don't understand it. It doesn't seem like it should be. I feel like I'm missing something because it seems such an obvious way to proceed. I would think that it had been done. Although I suppose if nobody's challenging it, there's little impetus to do it. That's the other thing. What if it turns out that research showed you need 15 points? Does that suddenly mean all the people who are convicted on 8 and 12 are now subject to having their cases reviewed? In which case, the prosecutors are not going to be interested in proceeding, right?
No, no, they're not. And fingerprints are one of the oldest forms of physical evidence that have been used for identification. I think we mentioned that last week. The first sort of idea of linking fingerprints with criminals was published in 1888, I believe, yeah, by Francis Galton, who's sort of the father of fingerprints. But fun fact, he actually got the idea from Charles Darwin because he had been sent the idea by Henry Faults in the mid 1800s, and he forwarded it to Galton. And said,
Wow.
I know, isn't that a fun fact?
Yeah. Yeah. Very
Oh.
interesting.
So anyway, Galton published, and it was just called Fingerprints, Fingerprints, in 1888, and that was the foundation for using fingerprints to identify criminals specifically on a regular basis.
And
And
was that a
then
book or a paper?
paper, it was a paper. And then now we have, after there's been different methods proposed and different ways of doing things, but I think probably consistently most people use like 10 print cards, and then you have some unknown print that's collected, and then you compare it to those cards. And they used to all be manual, and now places have AFIS systems, so those automated fingerprint identification systems. The problem with AFIS is that they're run by individual jurisdictions, and so AFIS in Des Moines, Iowa, their system may not be compatible with the AFIS system in Lincoln, Nebraska.
I thought that was a federal system. You're telling me it's jurisdiction by jurisdiction?
AFIS is. Then there's also IAFIS, which is the one run by the FBI. That's the integrated automated fingerprint identification. So that's the national database. AFIS is individual jurisdiction databases.
And here's the question that inquiring minds would like to know. Given the incredible things that are possible with image processing and now AI coupled with image processing, why don't we have this done automatically, which would make it completely objective? Why do we have to have examiners?
I think there are people who have tried that, and it's completely dependent on the prints that go into the system. So you know how on TV when like they put a print in the system and it's like boom, match. That's not how it works. APHIS will come back with, so you set the number. You say, okay, APHIS, I want you to search whatever our database, however many prints. The FBI IAPHIS currently holds 55 million sets of fingerprints, which is a lot. Smaller jurisdictions will have fewer, but you're like, I want you to search through this database and I want you to return with 25 potential matches or 25 that you think could potentially be the same as this one. So Avis will search, bring back those 25, and then they are identified by a person and either excluded or included for further comparisons.
It seems to me that should be send me the one match is what I would want.
But if there's nothing in those 25, then you say, okay, there was nothing in that 25, send me 25 more. And you get 25 more. But it's the information in the database is only as good as the data, right? So if you upload a crappy out of focus image, or somebody used too much powder, or something was smudged, then APHIS might disregard those ones and not include them.
So my response to that with my defense attorney hat is if the image is so degraded that you can't use it by this system, why should I trust a human being subject to all kinds of potential biases?
Yeah. And bias in fingerprints is a big deal. There's been quite a few studies on bias in fingerprints. And we talked about the Mayfield case last week, right? About the Madrid bomber. I wonder if part of the issue isn't that fingerprints are so ingrained that while your argument is a logical one, I feel like people would disregard it as a defense attorney. I mean,
yeah, I think you're right.
They would just be like, well, but fingerprints.
But fingerprints.
That's right. I thought we should start with fingerprints before we move to the NAS report. I think we should talk about a couple more like major groups of evidence. I feel like I think we should go after bite marks next, because then we really get to pick on the FBI.
Yeah. The bite marks thing is a disgrace.
It is a disgrace. Uh,
Fingerprints, we can argue over their utility. We can talk about their usefulness historically, and
yeah.
there's a certain degree of technical, what I want to say, that it's not it's not ideal, but at least we know they work in principle. Bite
Hmm.
marks, on the other hand, are just snake oil all the way down.
They are. Did we talk about this last week? I don't even remember now.
No, no,
No.
we
Okay.
haven't. We've mentioned them in passing,
Yeah.
and maybe I shouldn't say anything more. We should wait
Okay.
till the next episode. So what
Yeah.
what what remains that we haven't discussed with respect to fingerprints?
I think we could probably safely leave it there unless you have something else. So we used last week an example of the Madrid bomber to show in that example how fingerprints were used and were
Wrong.
incorrect, right? It was not the right person. And so I just wanted to talk more about them today because I do think that people probably assume, I know in my students' case this is true, that there is a set number of minutiae or points that you have to have, and that's not true. And that, the database doesn't throw back one fingerprint, it throws back however many you tell it to give back to you. And then a human being takes those 10 that APHIS kicks out, and then they manually compare them. I don't know. I haven't read much about anybody working with AI for fingerprinting. I'm sure there's somebody looking at it, but I I don't know. I did I did read the results of some research that, to make you feel better, fingerprint experts do score higher than novices when identifying fingerprints.
Well, yeah, they better, hadn't they?
I mean, baby steps.
Yeah, yeah, baby steps. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Well,
I think next week we should talk about bite marks because they're another pattern evidence, another type of pattern evidence that is problematic. Although fingerprints are significantly less problematic than bite marks. I think there's just some things that I don't want to say that they shouldn't be used for identification. It just concerns me if you have fingerprints as the only physical evidence in a case and you have somebody making conclusions off of 8 points or something.
okay, so if we're going to talk about bite marks next time, when are we going to extend this a little and talk about blood spatter, or do you want to save that for another episode?
We could combine, talk about
Next
bite
week?
and blood spatter. Yeah.
Okay. So
Knock out
so
the major pattern ones at one time.
all right. So we're reaching the end of today's discussion of fingerprints. Do I have that correct?
I think so. Did we miss something major? I don't know. I feel like it was a little anticlimactic.
I don't know. All right. So let's leave it there. And next time we'll talk about blood, and we'll talk about biting.
Yeah. And we've heard from some of our listeners that we haven't been doing a good job of posting links. Is that right? So we will get the link to this chapter for you, author of Glenn Langenberg. We will get that chapter posted.
I'll post the whole book.
Oh, all 422 pages?
Yeah, there's a link. I found the link so you can download the book for free.
Okay.
That way, those of
Money.
our listeners who want to become fingerprint experts will be off on a. It's available as a free PDF. Why not?
Well, that's because it's paid for by tax money. That's why.
Yeah. So you guys have already paid for it. You
That's
deserve
right.
to have
You
a
might as well
copy.
read it. You might as well read it.
There you go.
Yep.
Okay. Well, that calls it a day. I don't even have a beverage. Oh, wait a minute. Yes, I do. I had a beverage in front of me. The dregs of my coffee here.
Oh, mine's almost gone, but mine's the same always when I'm at home. So, oh, ooh, before we go, we are one day away from our last tick trial. And
Oh,
guess what?
wow.
I sat in the lab with those ticks yesterday and they did nothing. Absolutely nothing. I didn't have a single tick make a choice.
I don't know where this was, and I meant to copy to you. And I hesitate to even tell you this story, but I came across a description of a dead deer that was in the remain stage, and the
Okay.
person who found it commented on how it was surrounded by a huge number of ticks, questing ticks. So it reinforces what I believe is your false impression that ticks are attracted to decomposing animals, but they're not cooperating, right?
No. And there was massive amounts of CO2 coming off of that dead rabbit compared to the control. And they still weren't. Like even unless there is some like counterbalance of decomp VOCs where ticks are like, yeah, there's a lot of CO2, but I'm also smelling this, I'm also smelling that, and I don't want anything to do with that, so I'm staying away.
That staying away is not something I see ticks ever do. So I'm skeptical that they're staying away from anything. I do believe it's well within their tiny little brains to frustrate researchers who are trying to show any sort of association. So,
Yeah.
well, cool. So we'll get sort of a definitive, non-definitive update on tick
Mhm.
experiments next time as well.
Yeah,
Oh, that's excellent.
I think so.
Well,
Yeah, I
okay,
hope so.
that's it for today.
Okay, sounds good. See you all for episode 13.
Fingerprints, fingerprints. Okay,
Jazz
bye.
hands.